Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Major Ryan Ratcliffe, who is an EA-6B electronic warfare officer and Joint Terminal Attack Controller assigned to the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations Staff. Ryan Ratcliffe, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, John, thanks for having me.
So just to our audience real quick, Major Ratcliffe's opinions are his own and do not reflect the opinions of the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Ryan, will cover your recent article entitled Cognitive Warfare, Maneuvering in the Human Dimension, which, by the way, you co-authored with another Marine officer, Major Andrew MacDonald. And we will have a link to this article in the show notes to our audience for those who'd like to check it out a little bit more. But before we get into your article, Ryan, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you like, just your overall comment on the times in which we live?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that our strategic landscape reflects a growing element of both complication and complexity. So complicated in the sense that it's difficult to understand a lot of the technological, scientific, mathematical advances, but also complex because there's a lot of interactions between variables. And so you have these silos of excellence that are all interwoven in this very complex web. And then that is all exacerbated by a very high pace of change. So between the information age and intelligentization, as artificial intelligence comes to light, not only is the strategic landscape complicated and complex, but it is rapidly changing. So we know that China is a peer competitor that may be peaking. Russia and Ukraine continue to be embroiled in a fight for the existence of Ukraine's democracy. And North Korea continues to be North Korea, and Iran and the Middle East more broadly are embroiled in new turmoil. And then you have the intersection of technology and capital, where you have private corporations accelerating some of these change. So it's very difficult to navigate all of these challenges. And then we wrote this article about cognitive warfare because now it's starting to, those challenges are starting to converge at the level of the individual and their cognition.
Yeah, that's a great outlook there. And again, to our audience, we will have links to various different resources in the show notes. And we've had several episodes which have focused on complex systems and complexity in our national security landscape today. So check out the show notes if you want some additional discussion related to complex systems. All right, so to your article, why did you and Major MacDonald write this article? For example, was this part of some sort of a career level school or other DoD schooling that you attended?
Yeah, so Major MacDonald, call sign Ducks. He and I have grew up in a squadron together. We did 3 deployments together. Obviously developed a deep friendship, and we both recently completed military school. So he did Air Command and Staff College as well as the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, or SAS. Meanwhile, I was doing a civilian school program through the Marine Corps at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And then I left, completed my program at SICE, and was attached to the Deputy Commandant for Information. So Ducks and I regularly bounced ideas back and forth. And then we actually listened to Colonel Koichiro Takagi's podcast here on the Cognitive Crucible. And we'd had a lot of these ideas for this article kind of floating around between us. And that podcast helped some of those ideas kind of congeal into what became the framework for this article, based off of what both Ducks and I were seeing at the time. And then some of these ideas that have been thrown around. And then, the discourse that the Cognitive Crucible helped promote.
All right, that's awesome. It's great to get a shout out for that podcast, and that it's fantastic to know that the variety of guests and topics find willing ears, even if it's kind of like a niche topic. So that's fantastic. So your article starts with a fictional crisis, which occurs in Okinawa, Japan. Do you think you could give a short recap of what this fictional crisis was and talk about how this fits into the concept of cognitive warfare?
Yeah, absolutely. So the scenario opens with a cyber attack on Okinawa's critical infrastructure, particularly its power grid. But the attack, unbeknownst to the victims, is multifaceted and it's precision targeted. So as power begins to be restored, the attack has also targeted communications pathways to herd the citizens affected by the attack toward specific pathways in which disinformation lay in wait. So that disinformation was designed to prey on latent fissures and advance people toward existing proclivities that caused increased tensions and ultimately harmed the US-Japanese relationship because it opened those fissures and deepened some of those divides. And what we've seen in the days, we wrote this article about a year ago, and what we've seen since then is some of the techniques that we've laid out have come to pass. We've seen layered cyber and attacks with disinformation in Taiwan. We've seen disinformation used in Hawaii alongside natural disasters. And while the effectiveness of these have been limited so far, kind of the bottom line is they aren't effective until they are. And because of the complexity of the environment, as has already been discussed, once they are effective, it's very possible that these types of attacks could have nonlinear effects that redefine strategic dynamics, kind of what we outlined with Japan and Okinawa.
Right. And I know you're going to probably get into this just a little bit more, but what you were describing there is an example of maneuver warfare, right? You've got like two different uh, 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 capabilities coming together to create an effect. Would you say that that's fair? In this case, it was like a cyber attack followed by an information attack, just very, very broadly speaking.
No, absolutely. And, we, being Marines, we talked much about the maneuver warfare aspect of this. We also talked about kind of the combined arms aspect. So you're using multiple types of effects. Now, these were predominantly in the information environment, whether it be the cyberspace domain or the human dimension. But when you start expanding the realm of the possible and look at what could be done in other domains in addition to these layered effects in the information environment, you start to gain a picture of what's been called combined arms in the information age, or information maneuver, which we'll probably talk about here in a little bit.
Yeah, cool. So also in your article, you and Dux assert that the United States and presumably other free societies, but maybe let's stick with the United States for now, is falling behind in confronting national security challenges at the intersection of technology and cognition. Could you unpack this just a little bit more for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think unless we begin working on an understanding of what the human dimension and the cognitive dimension means holistically, we're going to develop centers of excellence that can offer tactical capabilities and options rather than the ability to operate from the tactical through the strategic level. And so we'll ultimately get small units that can go support tactical actions, but we're going to lack the ability to promote unity of effort and unity of action at the strategic level across the US government. So kind of to nug down from the theoretical into a real example, I think one challenge that we have right now is TikTok. So for legitimate reasons, the US government is precluded from being able to, by and large, use TikTok. But millions of younger generations are gaining a significant amount of their information flow off of TikTok. But the US government is really hamstrung outside of a few of these centers of excellence that can get waivers they're hamstrung from knowing what is going on in TikTok and then addressing some of those mis and disinformations, and disinformation campaigns. So as I mentioned earlier, you have the public sector that is focused on, in theory, providing for the security of its citizens, and you have the private sector, which is developing capabilities designed to promote capital and answers to its shareholders' revenue. But these are evolving separately from one another, and there is a lack of kind of a holistic understanding in either one of the implications of the other. So as these evolve, we have to understand how to operate within that realm so that we don't have something like TikTok that is running away from what the US government is able to do. Meanwhile, the US government is building these capabilities for platforms that are becoming outdated very quickly.
So let me see if I'm understanding what you're saying here. So, U.S. government employees, service members, civilians of the U.S. government are not allowed to have TikTok installed on their government devices, and you're saying that, among other things, this creates a on one hand, TikTok may not be directly influencing government employees, but one of the effects is that it's almost kind of like government employees are potentially getting nerfed, like their daily experiences are not swimming in, or not, they're not experiencing the reality of the world today by like guardrailing off this app. Am I kind of going in the right direction on that?
Yeah, precisely. So because of their inability to operate within the space that is created by TikTok, they're unable to answer to these mis and disinformations effectively at scale. And again, there are options to get around that, and there are legitimate national security concerns for using TikTok. That's been explored very heavily in the congressional space. You can find a lot of the testimonies on some of the threats that TikTok's information flow has, and why it shouldn't be installed on government devices. But because of that limitation, the U.S. government employees and service members are limited in their ability to operate in the information environment.
I love the expression, and I haven't used it on the podcast in a while, but history does not repeat, but it rhymes. And people can always poke holes in these like simple ways of looking at the world, but sometimes it's kind of helpful to really simplify things. But I'm picking up on an analogy here, and you're an aviator, but 100 years ago with Billy Mitchell, right, and how he was just railing against the establishment 100 years ago about air power and the promise of air power, and how we collectively need to get on board because it's a major future capability. And what you're describing also seems, again, it's not identical, but it rhymes in that if senior leaders are not allowing people to be exposed to these real world environments, then there is something missing, or there's something potentially getting missed here. What's your reaction to that?
Well, to be clear, as far as I'm aware, there's no directives preventing individuals from using TikTok on their personal time or devices. But I will also say, Billy Mitchell ultimately was court-martialed for his proselytizing that he did on behalf of air power. But he was right at the same time. You saw that the developments in carrier aviation that took place during the interwar period set the stage for U.S. success in the Pacific Wars, or in the war in the Pacific, particularly in its early years. And the changing dynamics that he helped usher in really ultimately underpinned a lot of U.S. success in World War II. So I think that the lesson from that rhyme, which I do agree that it would be a rhyme, the lesson is that we have to remain open-minded, and it's important to explore the implications of these developments and technological developments, particularly in an interwar period, and particularly when it's taking place on our homeland. The information environment knows few boundaries, and once it begins to impact, what I mentioned earlier, we saw mis and disinformation that was tied to artificial intelligence in the wake of a natural disaster. That natural disaster was the fires in Maui, and there's a good New York Times article that really captures some of the AI generated effects or AI generated media that came out about those natural disasters, and that's the American homeland. And so we need to begin to recognize these threats against American citizens, even if it is in the cognitive space. But those threats are occurring and being interpreted within the U.S. homeland, and then that should have and should carry with it some weight and some urgency.
So I'd like to ask you about the concept of information maneuver, and a lot of this falls under the umbrella of like evolving doctrine, evolving terminology. You ask 10 different people, you get 10 different answers, that kind of a thing. But want to ask you about information maneuver and how that potentially fits into your cognitive warfare concept. For example, does it align with your recommendation to develop and implement a concept that treats the cognitive dimension as both offensive and defensive maneuver space? So take that in whatever direction you think is productive.
No, I agree. That is certainly an amorphous concept that is kind of come into fruition, but I think it's an important one to discuss. And for us, based on for myself and Dux, I think that information maneuver involves applying the tenets of maneuver warfare and kind of that mentality that you mentioned earlier, layering effects, getting after the system of war fighting that the adversary is putting forward, and looking for the opportunities to have nonlinear effects. I think it's just taking that mentality and applying it to the information environment and how information effects can be used to augment maneuver warfare more broadly. So in the offensive and defensive realm, every action in the physical domains has some type of cognitive effects, as long as somebody is there to perceive it. You can have if the tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, to make a sound.
Yeah.
But as long as those actions are perceived, then there's going to be some type of cognition involved, the processing of information to mean something by individuals. But what the United States, what we think the United States really needs to focus on is upholding truth and reliability that underpin its legitimacy on the international stage. And by working to incorporate and apply those principles to its efforts to maneuver within the information environment, or to use information effects to support maneuver warfare or United States war fighting concepts more broadly, that's how we think that understanding these technological advances and these scientific advances in the realm of human psychology and cognitive psychology, that's how the United States can use that to augment its offensive and defensive capabilities in pursuit of this kind of broader information maneuver idea.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's awesome stuff. Agree with all that. So you said this article came out about a year ago or so. So what's been the reception?
Yeah, so we wrote it about a year ago, and then it was released in the spring of this year, 2023, and the reception's been generally pretty positive. We made some additional personal connections from individuals who found the article and reached out via various medium. But I think one of the interesting things is, when we wrote it a year ago, we just observed kind of the first layering of cyber and disinformation in the wake of then Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. But since then, we've seen a rise in generative AI capabilities ChatGPT-4 clearly made some waves, and that came out around the time that this was written. The ability to create AI-generated images has changed drastically. And then, as I mentioned previously, the David Sanger's New York Times article talking about generative AI and disinformation came out in the wake of the Maui fires. And so we've seen a lot of these capabilities begin to be put into play with debatable effectiveness. But as I mentioned earlier, they're not effective until they are. And it really only takes that one nonlinear effect producing operation to change the strategic landscape or to have strategic effects. And that's why we think it is still urgent and vital for the United States and, as you mentioned earlier, kind of Western liberal centers of power to begin considering what their approach is to this idea of cognitive warfare.
Right. Yeah. 100%. I've been meaning to have onto the podcast for some time now, but there is NATO seems to be, really leaning into the cognitive dimension of warfare, especially. Do you have? We didn't really talk about this in advance, but do you have any quick thoughts on NATO's project related to cognitive warfare?
No, I do a little bit. Some of the research that we did on past exploration of the topic of cognitive maneuver and cognitive warfare, a lot of that came out of NATO, and I think you see that because going all the way back to Soviet active measures time frame, European countries have been really in the crosshairs of Russia's disinformation tactics, and so Russia is also much quicker to, we'll say, test via deployment. So they will experiment in the real world with some of these techniques. And so I think what you see is NATO getting a firsthand look at the potential effects of these. You see the disinformation that has surrounded the war in Ukraine that started in with the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and then ramped up in February of 2022. And so I think for NATO, it is a very pressing and urgent priority because of their, for lack of a better term, they're on the forward line.
Their proximity,
cognitive warfare.
Right. Yeah. And, to our audience, the gentleman I'm talking about is Paul Grostad. I actually met him a few months ago and have been meaning to get him onto the podcast to talk, to unpack all of this a bit more. So we will do that before too long. Stay tuned. Well, this has been a dynamite discussion, Ryan. Really important work, important contribution to the forum. Not just the podcast forum, but your paper with you and Dux. A really great contribution. So thank you for that. So perhaps we can do a quick lightning round and then close her out. What do you say?
Sounds good.
All right. Yeah, let's bring it. Okay. So lightning round, I don't know, 30 seconds, 1 minute or so per response, that kind of a thing. First lightning round, cognitive terrain. Is this a useful concept?
I think in many ways I view this as analogous to key cyber terrain. And I know I'm probably in the minority here, but I'm not a huge fan of the terms. I think they're too amorphous to actually mean something. But when it comes to moving from theory to actual execution, it can be a really useful tool for taking these ideas and making them executable. And I think as we start to look at a way of directing efforts in a meaningful approach, that terms like cognitive terrain and key cyber terrain are very helpful for us military-minded individuals who are used to these type of concepts in other domains.
Right. Yeah. And visualizing, right? We intuitively, speaking for myself, when I think of terrain, I think of mountains and valleys and something that I can visualize. And so if there's a way to visualize something that, and then you could say, think of this as cognitive terrain, then that could potentially be useful. Next lightning round, public affairs or media relations or Stratcom, and so public affairs and influence integration.
Yeah, I think that is vital for the purposes of maintaining that truthful narrative and keeping each in its lane. So during some of my past work at the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force Information Group, we had the public affairs, or at that time, communication strategy and operations team, sitting across the walkway from the psychological operations, military information support operations desk. And the purpose of that was to ensure that Comstrat did their role of informing the U.S. public, and that was deconflicted from the work that the psychological operations teams were doing. So I think the knowledge of each other's work, so that it is both complementary and deconflicted and upholds the values and the interests of the United States, is a vital element of integration.
Yeah, and I'm aware that at least the Air Force in particular, I believe, is really leaning into this. Obviously, you as a Marine, you're leaning into it as well. But the Air Force, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, very explicitly has given a direction to the Air Force, like I want public affairs better integrated into our overall influence capability. So, yeah, there's definitely something to that. Brain implants.
Yeah, so this was actually an unexpected discovery in our research for cognitive warfare and cognitive security more broadly. And it seems like it might be a long ways off, and in many ways they are, but the testing is occurring now. So, what we've seen are early tests on animals where, by stimulating parts of the brain through implants, behavior can be directed. And in many ways this could be helpful, because it's much like setting your alarm. You take an action at night so that the next day you get out of bed when you intend to get out of bed, and you're able to do what you intend to do. But when you begin to talk about taking away, or potentially taking away, your own future agency, we need to have some serious conversations about the legality of doing so, what type of restrictions need to be put in place. But once again, it's going to be by and large, the private sector, with their responsibilities to their shareholders, who are developing these capabilities. Meanwhile, our legislators are going to be struggling to keep up with the pace of change that we see on the West Coast, generally in Silicon Valley. So trying to ensure that we preserve that element of cognitive liberty as these type of capabilities develop is going to be a significant challenge, probably in the coming decades.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't used to be concerned. So for years now, people have been getting heart transplant or pacemakers.
Yes.
Put in their heart. And 20 years ago or 10 years ago, other than the risk or the medical necessity of having such a device, there wasn't too much of like cybersecurity risk,
right,
with pacemakers and these kinds of things. But today, I would imagine, I should probably have an episode that talks about this kind of hacking and cybersecurity risk as well. But I would imagine that people, bad guys, if they're just within the proximity of somebody who has a pacemaker, they can do things to the pacemaker which could be catastrophic. But that was a bit of a sidebar. But when I put onto the same sheet of paper the notion of having a pacemaker installed and having a brain implant, I mean, they're both implants, but for some reason the brain implant just really pushes all kinds of like worry buttons compared to a pacemaker, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you think about the potential for having a cyber security
Oh,
incident
oh,
involved in a cognitive implant or a brain implant,
yeah, yeah,
taking away human agency and having somebody act on your behalf, that's
yeah,
it's an interesting and
yeah.
conundrum for sure.
Yeah, it's like a new version of it's like a philosophical thought experiment, like the
Yeah.
like trolley problems, except with the brain, or something like that. But if there's one silver lining to this, so I mean, we should just probably assume if yeah, brain implants are going to happen. It maybe not tomorrow, but 20 years from now, people are going to have brain implants. It just is. If there's any kind of a silver lining to that notion, it is that unlike all the rest of the technology that we've developed to date, practically, unlike all of that technology, at least brain implant technology will have security built into it from the very beginning. Now, it doesn't mean that the security can't get circumvented or hacked or all of that kind of stuff, but at least it'll be mindfully built into this technology, I would think.
I would hope, and
I,
I
I
think
would hope.
that's
Yes. Yeah.
that's the challenge.
Right.
I think the opening to this podcast talks about cognitive security being a generational challenge, and I think ensuring that that type of security gets built into those cognitive implants is emblematic of that generational challenge.
Right. All right. Well, that was a long lightning round, but I actually added one on you, Ryan. Here, so one last one. This is a softball, but what are your something that hasn't really come up in this discussion, but I want to get your take on is the notion of competition or campaigning or actions that are like left of bang. What's your hot take on that?
So I've been doing some reading on kind of developing a campaigning mindset. It's touched on very well in MCDP 1 Tech 4 competing. And I have become a big proponent for the general concept of campaigning, which is thinking along longer time horizons, setting a desired outcome out in the future, and then arraying and interweaving various actions and effects that work toward that desired outcome. And the use of the terminology desired outcome is a change from an end state, because we recognize that competition and campaigning continues in theory indefinitely. And so the desired outcome is something that you wish to produce, but that does not mean that the competition comes to a close. And so when it comes to any of these types of influence activities, the further out that you look and the more effectively that you can array and then stick to that arrangement of effects and actions, the better postured you're going to be to achieve some of the successes that you intend to have.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Great take. All right. And wrapping up, could you recommend a good book or other online resource that some folks in our audience might check out? Yeah. What's on Ryan Radcliffe's nightstand these days?
uh, Too much to admit, unfortunately, but I would say for talking about the cognitive implants, brain implants, and the development of the human trajectory, Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus is a really interesting. It's not necessarily useful fiction, but he explores a bunch of possible alternative futures and how human development could advance and how that could change what it means to be human. The Age of AI and Our Human Future, written by Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, and Daniel Huttenlocher. It's actually a really interesting take on some of the implications of the rise of artificial intelligence. So you mentioned this is kind of became a more philosophical conversation, and they do a really interesting and a really good job of interweaving history with philosophy and modern technology. So you have Henry Kissinger, who's over 100 years old now, talking about his historical approach. Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, and Daniel Huttenlocher, professor on the topic, really interweaving those concepts. And then for the strategic landscape more broadly, I would say On Grand Strategy by John Lewis Gaddis, probably one of my favorite books of all time. Does a really good job about kind of thinking in time, working across time, space, and scale is one of his kind of monikers that he uses throughout that book. And then for understanding how to navigate kind of the complication and complexity of our environment, Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein is another one of my favorites. And it talks to the value of understanding these different concepts. And then when you approach a problem, find the structure of that problem, and then use your range of experience to come up with analogous solutions that you can use against that problem.
Wow. All right. Some fantastic suggestions. We'll have links to these, to those resources and the other resources that Ryan mentioned over the course of our discussion. And with that, Major Ryan Ratcliffe, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.